Well, hello again, family and friends. Last week on this series of videos, I told you the story about our desire to go to North Korea and how at the last minute, Kim Il-sung, the founder of that nation in 1948, passed away, and they were mourning his death and would not allow any tourists to come in. So they said to us, come next year. Well, the next year, 1995, we decided to try it again. And so we planned a trip to China for a week and then a week in North Korea. 22 people signed up for this trip on this time, and we had a really good group and we set off for China. The characteristic of each group is often different. This one was characterized by music. We had Marge and Henry from Abbotsford on the team. Henry was a great musician. He actually led a men's chorus out there in Abbotsford for years, and he loved to sing. And anything that happened would bring to mind a Christian song in Henry's mind, and we would all sing. The most interesting part of it was that as we had our meals in China, first in Shanghai, then in Beijing, we would sing our grace, our thanks to God for the food before we would eat. And we'd be in a large restaurant with all kinds of noise and people talking really loudly. And we would sing the doxology, for example, praise God from whom all blessings flow, or be present at our table, Lord. And it's a beautiful tune that has wonderful four-part harmony. And we learned to sing it in four-part harmony. And when we would start singing, the whole restaurant would just go silent. And they would listen to us sing. And when we're done, they'd all clap and respond that way. And I think they thought we were a traveling choir or something. But we had so much joy in singing everywhere we went on that trip. As I mentioned, we landed in Shanghai. And for most of the group, it was their first time to China, and so you always have to enjoy the city and learn about the city and environs of where you are. We did that for a day, and then we took a train and went to a neighboring city of Nanjing. Now, Beijing in Chinese means the capital of the north. Nanjing was the capital of the south, actually where Chiang Kai-shek was based prior to the revolution that ended in 1949, when Mao Zedong and the communist government took over the country. Nanjing is I think it was like a 4-hour trip from Shanghai, and we were there to visit what has become the largest Bible production center in the world. At that time, it was simply called the Amity Press, and they were just doing only 20 million copies of the Bible every year at that point. Now they're in the hundreds of millions, and it's much, much larger. I was just back there again in 2015, 6 years ago, and it was such a big place it took us half a day just to walk around it. Amity Press was actually a byproduct of Project Pearl when we delivered 1 million Bibles into China. One of our goals was to pressure China into printing Bibles inside the country instead of us having to bring them in from outside for Christians in the country. And that happened. The Bible Society and the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, the Protestant arm of the church in China, got together in the middle 80s, and they set up a big printing press in Nanjing. The paper and ink and things were supplied by the United Bible Society. The staffing and the operations was run by the Chinese brothers and sisters there. We went and had a wonderful visit there to see the first big center in China. This was in 1995, that was printing Bibles for the country and even some for outside the country, which of course now they do in significant numbers. As we finished our tour, it was about lunchtime, we were going to be taken to a special Chinese restaurant for lunch. We stood at the front door of Amity Press, and we began to sing "How Great Thou Art," that classic Christian song. And it turns out there were staff of Westerners who were working at the printing press operation there. There was a couple I know from New Zealand and some other Westerners. And when the families heard us singing, they all came to their windows and started clapping and cheering and singing along with us. And it was a very special moment. After that, we visited a Three Self church, which we usually did every city we went to, regardless of what day it was. Our tour guides, who weren't often non-Christians, would say, well, there's nothing going on in the church today. This was let's say it was a Monday or Tuesday. And we said, well, it doesn't matter. There's probably somebody there who we can talk to. Well, sure enough, when we got to the Three Self Church in Nanjing that day, there was a ladies' prayer meeting going on. And so we joined them. And they were so blessed to have these, even though we couldn't speak the same language, we had an interpreter through our guide, and we were able to communicate with them, and we sang together and we prayed together. It was a very special time. Go on then back to Shanghai, and from Shanghai we go on to Beijing. And in Beijing we tour as typical tourists do. As you know, there are so many things there to see. And we, of course, went to the Great Wall, as we do on just about every trip there, and to the other major sites. By the end of our first week, we received distressing news again. Our operator in this country, Stephen, came to us and said, you won't believe this, but when I went to get your visas, and of course, as I mentioned last week, we had sent all of our documents, photocopies of our passports, everything about us, way ahead, and had been pre-approved by the North Korean embassy in Beijing to go into the country as tourists. Stephen said, I went to get your visas, and they said, oh, sorry, we are now celebrating the first death anniversary of Kim Il-sung, who died last year. And we don't want any tourists here while we're celebrating the first death anniversary. And so here we are again. I've got 21 other people, and our plans have been changed. Stephen came to our rescue, our guide, wonderful brother, and he said, you know, I just came back from the country of Mongolia, and it was amazing. He said, I think your people would love to go and visit this country. We talked about it with the team, and sure enough, everybody said, yeah, none of us, I hadn't been to Mongolia. Not one of the 22 of us had ever been there. And so we agreed, and off we go to Mongolia. Mongolia is a very, very interesting country. You know, in the 13th century, Genghis Khan, who was their Mongolian empire leader, built an empire that was probably the largest in the world ever. And it was unfortunately done with a lot of violence, but nevertheless, that was a huge kingdom under Genghis Khan. Later, China took over that whole area, and they labeled the province that is still there today in northern China of Mongolian people group called Inner Mongolia, and they called the country, which we now call Mongolia, Outer Mongolia. Well, those two split in 1911 before the communist takeover. So in 1911, the group of people who lived up in the country of Mongolia, which at the time was called Outer Mongolia, those people decided they wanted to break away from China and establish their own country, and so they did. But then came the communist revolution in Russia, the neighbor to the north, and you can see here Mongolia is sandwiched now between China, and on the south of Mongolia is the Chinese province called Inner Mongolia, and then to the north is Russia, or at the time became the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union totally dominated Mongolia for the 70 years, basically, of its existence. And in the late 1980s, of course, the empire was crumbling, and Mongolia declared their independence. And so that became their time of change, a significant change from the early 90s onward. Mongolia is a country that is characterized by many, many different things. In fact, if you go online and look it up, you can see dozens of descriptions of Mongolia that would be a great interest to you. I want to just tell you about the top 7 things about Mongolia. We arrived in the summer. Remember, this is summer. It was July of 1995. One of the travelers on our team was a bit of a writer, and he wrote a book actually about all the different mission trips that he'd been on, and he was on this one. And I have his book, and I reread it again last night, and I was tickled to read his description. He said, "Mongolia put on her best summer dress, and she was beautiful." That was his description of this country. It's a country of rolling hills, beautiful grasslands. Much of the country is grassland. But it also has the second largest desert, part of the Gobi, in Asia. And so it has a lot of variety and a lot of mountains in the country as well. But the first thing that you notice is one of the significant things and the saying of the country. One of them, the best known sayings of Mongolia is that a man without a horse is like a bird with no wings. And they love horses. They have thousands of wild horses that just tear around because there's enough grasslands that they can survive somehow, even in the winter. And they love horses, and so horses were a very significant part in the scenery that we saw in the many, many miles and miles of open grasslands. Having the second largest desert in Asia also means they had camels, and Mongolia has the uniqueness of the 2-hump camels, not just one hump, but the double hump camels. Everywhere you go, we saw these 2-humped camels. Another factor of the country was, of course, its slogan, which is the land of the blue sky, and the beautiful, beautiful, varied countryside sceneries that you see. And people there live in these round, well, I think in our country we call them yurts mostly, but the local name in Mongolia for the round tent-like houses that they live in are called gers, G-E-R. And so they have a ger, and they live in the ger, almost all of them. The outsides almost all look identical as this one, but inside is quite interesting, the way that they can make beds that go around the circumference and spaces and whatnot for a family to live together inside these units. They are extremely hospitable people, and because they have a lot of horses, they have a lot of mare's milk from the horses, and their national drink is called erag, and they allow this horses or the mare milk to ferment, and then they serve it to their guests. This is a specialty. They are very insulted if you will not at least take a sip of this of this terribly tasting substance called erag. But they love it. It's their favorite, and it's what they've grown up with, and they love that. And finally, they love games, they love competitions, and celebrations. So every summer in early July, we were there in late July. In early July, they have a festival called Nadam, and for Canadians, it's their Calgary Stampede. And they love the events of that. The biggest deal is a long horse race that they have at that point. Well, we enjoyed our time in Mongolia. It was a beautiful country with beautiful people, and it was very interesting. Today, this just over 3 million population is the most sparsely populated sovereign nation in the world. Today is only, I think it's about 3.3 million people in that whole entire country. So it's a very interesting place. The capital city is a big city. A great percentage of the population live in that city, called Ulaanbaatar. And Ulaanbaatar has the distinction of being the coldest capital city in the world. That's the average temperature year-round is the coldest. You might know that the second coldest capital city in the world is a city called Ottawa, which happens to be here in our country of Canada. But we enjoyed the city, but much more so the countryside, and they gave us plenty of opportunity to enjoy the countryside. We went out and we slept overnight in a ger, for example. For the 22 of us, I think there were 3 different gers that we occupied. And in the evening of the day we arrived, one of our group went to the gift shop. They had a gift shop there for tourists. This was a tourist place. And lo and behold, the young lady, whose name was Mona was a Christian. And she was the first national Christian that we met on our trip there. And she was so excited when she found out that our group was made up of Christian people. And she just wanted to spend every minute she had with us. And before we said goodbye, we took a picture of Mona in front of one of our gers. And this young lady was a delight to meet. From there, we went back to the city and we began to visit, with permission, the different mission organizations that were there. Asian Outreach was one, and they had like a bookstore and all kinds of gifting items in a store there. And then they would have Christian materials, of course, for people who were interested in reading the Bible or other materials. There was also an association of missions, because Mongolia was dominantly Buddhist and didn't want to have many Christian organizations there. They allowed a consortium of Christian organizations to work together. And so we went there to visit them as well. And while we were there, we learned one of the most significant things about the country for us as Christians. And that is that in 1990, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, there were about 5 people in Mongolia known to be Christians. 5 people only in an entire country at that time of probably well over 2 million people. And by 1995, when we arrived, there were 3,500 Christians that assembled in 20 different churches. And that was the most incredible thing that we experienced, was the opportunity to visit some of those churches and to worship with those new believers in a country that previously had very, very few. So we again said, it wasn't a bad thing that we didn't get to go to North Korea. We had such an amazing time in Mongolia that we said, if we ever get a chance to come back here, and we wanted to, every one of us wanted to come back. It was so beautiful in the summer. We want to come at a Nadam for their big festival in early July. And on a future program, I will tell you about that.